for item 1 on an update on the emergency. Please, Jeff. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So we're in week 7 for Bury, as the first case of COVID-19 for Bury was 7 weeks ago. We had one of the first in the UK, and it's getting towards the end of the 4th week of lockdown. The council's role is to provide leadership for the borough through what undoubtedly is the longest and largest emergency we've ever faced, and to provide, as far as we can, all the essential services which the Bury people rely on the council for. We have, as we know from our previous meetings of this group, invoked the formal emergency planning processes and procedures. We circulated details of that at the first meeting of this group 2 weeks ago, but it's worth reminding members that we are organised now on the emergency planning gold, silver, bronze command and control structure, and that's just replaced our normal management arrangements. Our response to this emergency will, as with all emergencies, be organised around 3 phases: prepare, respond and recovery. We are in the middle of the response phase now. It's important to note that given the scale of this emergency, those 3 phases will continue to overlap. Our arrangements in Bury are, of course, locked into the Greater Manchester COVID-19 Emergency Committee, which in turn reports to government through COBRA. Within Bury, we're guided in all of our response by 6 objectives. First of all, to support the health and care system, who will be at the very sharp end of this emergency. We are already and will continue to be so. Secondly, to maintain our council essential services. Thirdly, to reduce the risk of infection, and it's for that reason why we've closed down many of our non-essential services.
Jeff, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you're coming through clear, but you're not very loud. It's as if the microphone's covered or something, I don't know. You're clear enough, but the volume, if you like, the sound volume is not very good. People older than me might struggle to hear.
So I've just turned up the volume. Is that any better?
I think that's a bit better, yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I'm just going through the objectives that are governing our response to the crisis. First of all, supporting health and care services. Secondly, maintaining our essential council services. Thirdly, reducing the risk of infection by closing some of our non-essential services. Fourthly, supporting communities. Fifthly, supporting business. And finally, supporting our staff. So I'll say a bit about those objectives by focusing on health and care, then communities, then business, and then council services. And I'll say something brief at the end about recovery. On health and care, given the depth of our partnership with the CCG, the council has very significant responsibility to support health and care services through the pandemic. As of yesterday, Bury had 233 positive COVID-19 cases. That was up 20 from Wednesday. There is still capacity within the critical care system in Fairfield and North Manchester hospitals, and I think that's the case across Greater Manchester. The new Nightingale Hospital at Manchester Central opened this week. That will expand considerably over the coming days and weeks to provide step-down facilities for COVID-19 patients from hospitals. I think the big change to report this week has been a shift in the predictions. For several weeks, we have been working on the basis of a worst case scenario of the peak of infections in Greater Manchester happening as early as this week. That has changed now, and the evidence is pointing to a flatter but longer peak, and that has been the guiding principle of our work over the last week. We are still confident that the hospitals will stay within capacity, but the bigger challenge is across the whole health and care system, including out-of-hospital services, particularly primary care, community health, mental health, and critically the social care system. So this last week we have been finalising our planning for the peak. In particular, we have been stress testing that planning. That work is now complete, and we are now adjusting the planning to fit that revised prediction of a flatter and longer peak. The result of that stress testing is now being used by all services to be ready for the next increase in cases. I would draw to members' attention, in particular, the COVID-19 facility at Prestwich, and we are now prepared to stand up, if necessary, a second and third versions of that facility, and significant changes in the way in which primary care are organised, and those changes will continue as cases increase. The three big risks we've been dealing with this week on health and care have been increased cases in the social care system, particularly in home care and in residential care settings. Secondly, the availability of personal protection equipment, PPE, for all staff, but particularly staff in primary care and social care. And thirdly, the risk of not having enough testing. On those three issues, we have significantly improved the linkages between primary care, with named GP practices now linked to all of our care homes, providing more intensive support. On PPE, we have secured more access for social care services to PPE that is being provided to Greater Manchester. I would say, though, that needs a lot more further work to ensure that we have a sufficient supply of PPE going forwards. And finally, on testing, we have secured access to Northern Care Alliance testing facilities in the borough for social care staff, as well as social care staff having access to testing facilities on a drive-through basis at Manchester Airport. Moving on, Chair, to support that we're providing to communities through the lockdown. First of all, the 5 community hubs are now come towards the end of their second full week of operation. We are supporting over 800 residents who have requested help. 500 of those have come forward over the last week. So you can see that the scale of operation is increasing. We're very fortunate to have over 700 volunteers who have come via the Bury Volunteer Community Faith Alliance or through the self-organised groups such as Kind Bury. The role of the community hubs is now coming into full play. They are focused on 3 cohorts: the most at-risk group of shielded residents who can't leave home for at least 12 weeks. Secondly, those people who are over 70 and who have underlying health conditions and are therefore also at risk. And then thirdly, the general population who may be socially or economically vulnerable because of COVID-19. We will report later on this agenda on the levels of welfare support available via the hubs. The hubs are now providing food supplies to those who can't get out and don't have help from friends and family. We are also providing support by distributing medicines where necessary, and contacting people to help them cope with loneliness and isolation and links to mental health services. Going forward, we want to provide more of a focus on carers through the hubs, and that's a priority for the week ahead. Also, in terms of communities, important to note the role we have with the police in enforcing the lockdown. Our training standards, environmental health and rationing officers are working very well with GMP to ensure that any infringements are dealt with. I would emphasise, though, that the very vast majority of Bury residents are completely complying with the restrictions. The exceptions, and they are very much exceptions, are in some cases house parties in various parts of the borough, young people grouping in parks or other open spaces, and still some instances of pubs having private sessions. They are, though, the exceptions. The vast majority of people are complying, and where there isn't compliance with the police, we are adopting an approach of engaging people first, explaining and encouraging people to follow the restrictions. And in nearly all cases, once people have been encouraged, they then do move to follow the restrictions properly. We did have risks, as you know, around the Easter weekend, and with the help of GMP, we managed to mitigate those risks, including the risks of people congregating at Peel Tower. That passed off very successfully. Moving on then to our support to the business community. I would emphasise the Office of Budget and Responsibility projections nationally this week, which really brought home the scale of the economic damage that could be caused by the epidemic. Within Bury, we have progressed well this week in distributing grants to business. We are distributing around about £40 million worth of grants in lots of 10,000 and 25,000 grants to Bury businesses. I'm pleased to say, as of yesterday, we had distributed £15 million of that funding. That's 38% of the total. We had staff working in our finance function all of the weekend to get those grants out. And where we are struggling to get grants out, it's mainly because we lack the bank details of the relevant companies, and we're writing to all those companies to urge them to give us those bank details, which will help us to get more of that money out. We are helping many businesses connect to the business interruption loan scheme being run by the government. Importantly, this week, we saw the launch of a new £3 million scheme to provide business loans to smaller businesses. This has been launched by the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. It's a very welcome development, and we are working with our Bury businesses to make sure that they can access those loans where they need to make faster progress getting resource for their cash flow. We are also making progress in concert with Deloitte in creating a team of staff, 10 staff seconded from different council services which have been stood down because of the COVID-19 crisis. Those staff are being retrained to reach out to Bury businesses on a prioritised basis, and Deloitte have helped us form a database of those companies which we think most need help. There's 327 companies on that database, 68 of which we think are most at risk of failure because of the lockdown. That's only the starting point. We won't restrict ourselves to that list of 327, but it's a starting point to provide more direct support. It's important to emphasise that that support is fully joined up with the support of the Greater Manchester Growth Company, who are doing a similar service across the whole of Greater Manchester. And we are talking to the Business Leadership Group about the recovery phase for the Bury economy, and we will be revisiting that in the coming weeks. Then finally moving on to the impact on council services, a major exercise this week has been to revisit all of our business continuity plans to make sure we are ready for that flatter and longer peak. The effect of a longer peak could be attrition on availability of council staff. So far, we have succeeded in continuing to deliver all of our essential services, children's safeguarding, obviously adult social care, refuse collection, to name but a few. We are working this week to make sure that we can continue to do that over a number of weeks as the peak of infection moves forward. We have successfully redeployed over 100 council staff from services which have been stood down into those services which are a priority, including, I'm pleased to say, redeployment into our community hubs and into supporting business. We will continue, of course, to support our staff. All of our staff will be under significant pressure because of the emergency, but I think in particular those staff who are still out there providing frontline services in the community and the pressure that they'll be under, as well as their families, of risk of infection. We're doing all we can to protect those staff. In conclusion, Chair, I just want to mention the recovery phase. I did touch on this last week, but we have, over the last week, started to put the flesh on the bones of our recovery planning. We will develop themes around preparedness for lifting of lockdown restrictions, thinking through pent-up demand, which will be in the system for many of our services, and how we respond to that, thinking through how we will capture the new ways of working that have emerged through this crisis, many of which we want to embed into a new normal way of working. I'm thinking in particular of more neighbourhood integrated services through the hubs and through more digital working across health and care services, but there'll be many other examples. I'm also building a recovery phase for our business community, our health and care services, and our education system. The biggest priorities, I think, in terms of recovery, though, are undoubtedly health and care, to make sure that the massive changes we're seeing in the healthcare system in the borough are managed through the recovery phase, and that we capture as a legacy the improvements in and more efficient ways of working. And then the second big priority in terms of recovery will be the budget. We'll talk about that later on this agenda, Chair, but I can't emphasise enough how important it will be for us to track the additional expenditure and the loss of income to the Council's budget and the CCG budget caused by the pandemic, and that we respond accordingly when we get into the recovery phase. So very happy to answer questions or take comments, Chair, on any of that update. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Thank you. Quick comment from me, if I may. You mentioned the hubs, the working of the hubs and the helpline number. I couldn't help but noticing that our helpline number is the only district across GM that's available 7 days a week. All the other districts seem to take Sunday off, and some take Saturday and Sunday off. Do you have a comment there, Jeff? I mean, are we offering too much? Are we stretching our people too much, or do you think it's what the people of Bury are entitled to?
I would say the latter, Chair. People's needs at a time of crisis do not follow the Council's working hours, and it's really important that at the weekends and through the bank holiday, help is on hand through the support of our volunteer staff in the hubs, and of course through the tremendous support of the voluntary and community organisations that are linked into those hubs. We are trying to provide support, not 24 hours a day, but 7 days a week, and we will continue to try and do that, Chair.
Right, thanks, Jeff. So comments, colleagues, has anybody got any questions for Jeff on what he's had to say?
Chair, can I ask a couple of questions? It's Tim.
Tim, please do, Tim, go ahead.
So 2 questions. The first one is around the hubs and volunteers. So it's marvellous, I guess, that we've got 700 volunteers now, because I think a couple of weeks ago it might even have been only 100. So it's really good that that's grown so much. But I just wondered what level of utilisation we're making of volunteers, or whether or not, because I've heard reports of some volunteers who've not been asked to do things potentially, or whether or not that's something that's now going to happen. And linked to that is obviously 750,000 people a few weeks ago put their hands up to volunteer for an NHS volunteering scheme, and there are also media reports of them not being linked up in the local area. So I just wondered if that's something that was happening. And then my second question was just about, it feels quite trivial in the current situation, but one of the first actions the council took was to seal up street litter bins and dog bins. And I understand why that might have happened, but I wondered whether that was on a basis of a resilience because of staffing levels issue, or whether or not it was on a health and safety or issue, and whether or not restoring that might be something we might be able to look at as things go forward. Because obviously we don't want to, there's only a certain amount of time that you can seal up litter before it becomes an issue, I guess. So I just wondered if that was something that was being thought about. Thank you, Chair.
If I take the second question and then ask Lynn Ridsdale to come back.
That's fine, yeah.
Just on the bins for dog mess, the decision to take them up was taken solely on the basis that we couldn't have our frontline staff spending time going around emptying those bins when they are desperately needed on the refuse collection rounds. So we redeployed those staff to do other essential services. The view was that we would expect dog walkers to take their dog mess bags home with them. We put up signs to that effect. It was felt better to do that than either denude our other services, particularly refuse collection, from what's needed staff resources, and also, frankly, to have staff out at risk of infection when the service could be taken care of by people taking their own mess home.
Len, do you want to add about the hubs? Thank you.
Yeah. So you are right with your observations. I'm really pleased that we've managed to increase the numbers of volunteers, so we've got that capacity up. But no, we aren't making full use of the full cohort yet. That is partly because the demand level, whilst it is steadily increasing, it's still not huge. It's still at a level that we can contain. But also we've done a lot of work over the last week to work with other suppliers that can help share the burden as well. So things like, and it's not all Bury's doing, but the supermarket's now getting much better organised around shopping deliveries. The pharmacies are sorting out now some of the direct deliveries, and government has helped with that. So there are other things moving around us that take that initial sort of heavy lift away from our hubs. So we're probably using about a third of them actively. I'd say there's about sort of 250 that are in active use, but we are very mindful we need to engage the others. The plan that the Chief just referred to is the way that we will do that. So we've been using this time to work in parallel to think how we might now really engage this community capacity. So there will be another paper coming forward which talks around how we do much more on social engagement, connection, anti-isolation, and extends our reach beyond the most vulnerable people to offer something much broader across everybody within the community that is feeling vulnerable or needs support. So there will be another plan coming that absolutely looks how we engage those people better. And as part of that, we will wire the NHS volunteers into that. We haven't made strong use of them yet. We have engaged them through the hubs. It's been quite difficult to connect a national arrangement at the same time as we've been standing things up locally. It was a bit lumpy around the way in which it was organised, and I don't think we're therefore the only district that hasn't made full use of them yet. But our plans around upping significantly our offer will be a way to draw on that capacity as far as we possibly can. So watch this space.
Thank you, that's perfect. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Lynn. Just to let colleagues know that I know Andrea joined us late. She had trouble getting in, but she's now with us. And Councillor Timur Tariq, he's tried and failed. My technology wizard in the group has not been able to join us.
He's in now. He's in now, Chair.
Oh, he's in now. He succeeded.
I am here, Chair.
Okay. So any more points then from Jeff? We're rejigging things. I mean, a very late agenda came out. So the next item will be the urgent decisions. We're doing the financial update.
Can I just come in on that one? I was told today that a lot of PPE was dropped off at Openshaw and has now been dropped off at the 10 Greater Manchester Council districts. So we should have, we've even got it or we've got it coming. But the other issue is that PPE has gone up threefold, if not fourfold. For a lot of providers. We're helping providers with those costs, but it's actually getting hold of the PPE at the moment that's the issue, because it's just the stocks are just drying up. So there's going to be more and more kind of emphasis on that emergency stock. So we need to make sure that government are delivering on this, because we don't want to leave any provider without stock. So that's the only thing I wanted to say.
Any other points for Jeff, please?
David, just a comment, really, more than a question, just to say on the update around community hubs, I think it's fair to say, I mean, I know I've said it privately to the Chief Executive, but I think Bury's done very well in the establishment of the hubs and the Gold Silver Command setup. It seems to be working very well. And from speaking to people who've received food and things, they're very grateful to how it's all working. So thank you.
That's always good to hear, Nick. Thank you for that. In that case, can we move on? Was there somebody wanting to come in? No. Can we move on then to what was previously item 3 on one iteration of the agenda? Urgent decisions, executive functions. This is about the release of finances. I'm sorry, is there somebody there? Yeah. Has anybody got any comment? We're asked to consider whether the decision can be deferred. Can I suggest that I don't think it can? I think it's pretty self-evident that it cannot be deferred. Is there anybody in disagreement with that approach?
No.
No.
Thank you. Janet, are you able to give us an update on the virtual meetings and where we're trying to get to with the whole setup, please?
I can, Chair, thank you very much. I don't propose to go through the report. I know there's quite a bit of detail in there, and I'm going to assume that members hopefully have had an opportunity to look at it. It's an overview of the regulations and some proposals really around each of the various types of meetings we've got. Just going to focus on the recommendations and just highlight a few points around those. I think the first point is really that I think it's been recognised that there are a number of differences between the status of everybody's IT. And I think to a degree, I think IT is going to be key and king around these various arrangements. And I think it's going to be necessary, particularly for all elected members, that their IT provision is going to have to be looked at and reviewed. And I think that's going to be important going forward to try and move more toward virtual meetings. As regards the second recommendation, I think the position clearly is that there are IT restrictions and difficulties that we need to work through to enable certainly press and public attendance at meetings and then being able to see and hear exactly what's going on. And I think it's important that we continue to progress with that. And I think we're going to have at least as a minimum that press and public can actually at least hear and see what's going on. If possible, for us to stream it and stream meetings where possible, and that's something we're still looking at. And I think we have to understand that certain meetings really require more participation than just hearing and seeing. I think particularly thinking more around our regulatory committees such as licensing, where we may have, for example, taxi drivers coming before panels that actually need to, in the interest of natural justice, have more of a participatory involvement. And what I'm trying to do within the report is to come up with some options of how we may do that. But again, I think that's going to be around the available technology. Moving on to the other points around annual council, I think at the moment, again, then depending on technology, it would be great if we could have a normal meeting with everyone participating. But I think we're recognising at the moment there may be restrictions around available technology, particularly for members. So I think if that still remains, what we would as a minimum be looking at is very much an arrangement similar to the last council meeting, where we look to be at least quorate and that members who are available and able to attend are able to access meetings in a virtual way, being able to be heard and be seen. Not that we would necessarily restrict it to that, but I think it's going to be involving some work again, similar to the last meeting, around ensuring that all the political parties feel that they're adequately represented to ensure that we are quorate. And you'll see also recommendations where I've proposed that we limit the agenda to appointing the mayor, looking at nominations for the various panels and committees for the year going forward, and looking about this issue of a dispensation for members who can't meet the 6-month rule for attendance at meetings. Mayor making, I've indicated, I think that should and will still go ahead. We'll look to have, in fairness to Councillor Pickstone, a proper meeting, a proper ceremony later on in the year when we can. It may be at that stage that you may want to pick up on looking at and reflecting on the time we're having now and how that's impacted on the borough. The Constitution requires that, and suggests that you have an annual State of the Borough debate, and that may be something that you want to consider around that time as well. I've mentioned the agenda which is there, and I think also looking at other meetings, which I've indicated that we should have a resumption back to our normal meetings plan as soon as possible. Again, dependent on available technology. But I think also in the report I've also commented that as regards urgent decisions, I think whereas we may want to move back into a normal timetable schedule of meetings, I think we have to accept that at the moment we're still in a position that there may well be urgent decisions that still need to be made. So it may be we're in a sort of hybrid situation where we will have scheduled meetings, but these types of meetings you may need to organise at fairly short notice to make those sorts of decisions. So hopefully I've covered all of the various issues, Chair, and if there's any questions, please feel free. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you. There's quite a lot in that, in a way. Does anybody have any comments, observations, fears?
Dave?
I'm sorry, who's that? Is that Bob?
Bob, yeah, sorry.
Go on, Bob. Yeah.
We've got no date in this at all, Janet. I mean, when are we saying, I mean, everything, as you know, I mean, you'd have to be a sage to know what's going to happen next week, never mind in 3 weeks' time. But let's assume, God willing, that we're out of lockdown. Will it be partial on the 7th? Will it be fully? But let's say going forward by the end of May, we're in the clear. Presumably we'll go back to status quo, will we?
I think the theory is yes. I mean, we say that, but it may well be that certain of the meetings you make a decision that you would like to continue with virtual arrangements, some briefings, some meetings, you may want to do that. But I think the plan is that that's what will happen. I mean, at the moment, the meetings that were scheduled for next week have either been, the items have been deferred or the meetings have been cancelled. And you'll appreciate there was a fairly low number of meetings during this period because in theory, we should have been in Purda. Now, I know there is a hope or a suggestion that we try and organise at least a proper cabinet meeting, if you will, and possibly a scrutiny meeting between now and annual council. And I think if we can facilitate that with the IT available, I mean, we tried a dummy run today with a different facility for this meeting and it didn't work. But I think clearly we're still working on that. We're still working hard on trying to do that. So in theory, if we could before annual council have any other meetings, we'll obviously do that. Annual council, obviously, I think we want that to be, at least if we haven't achieved that prior to that date, to be the sort of start of the municipal year. But as soon as, yes, restrictions are lifted and indeed members feel comfortable resuming meetings in obviously in the town hall, that's what we would move back to doing. But as I say, if there are certain meetings that members feel that they could actually still proceed and progress virtually, then that will be set up and be available.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Dave.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Janet. Any other comments from Janet for Janet then, please, colleagues?
Chair, could I just ask
Tim? Please do.
Or two thoughts. The first one is at annual council, we were originally scheduled to receive a report from the Democratic Arrangements Forum about some fairly small but quite important changes about how full council operates, and they did sort of have general all-party support at the Democratic Arrangements Forum. So I do wonder whether that is something that we could add on to that agenda, so that when we do get back to normal, whatever that is, those good ideas for changes can take place, I guess. The second thought is I would very much support the suggestion that we ought to have a scrutiny committee and or a health scrutiny committee in this period that, we would have been in Purda because of the local elections, wouldn't we? But we're not. Because I think just around what is happening with all of, with the virus and everything, I think it's quite important that there is some member scrutiny of that. So I think it would be very worthwhile to have one or both of those scrutiny meetings now almost, as soon as that can be organised. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks,
Dave.
Yes, Andrea.
Yeah, I'd certainly support health scrutiny at the moment. I think Tim's quite right. We need to meet health scrutiny, especially with what's going on. So yeah.
Yeah, again, I think it's very sensible, and I think Janet has got that on board. I think she's working towards that. I think she said at the outset, it's all reliant upon the technology. Technology is king in these times, I think, and if that allows us to do it, then we can do it. Any other points for Janet then?
Sorry, Councillor Jones. Sorry.
Oh, Julie. Yeah, Julie.
Just responding to Tim Pickstone's comment around the Democratic Arrangements Forum. There will be a part in the annual council that does deal with the minor amendments to the Constitution. So it will pick up some of those issues that we discussed at Democratic Arrangements Forum. And we did discuss also about having all leader briefings prior to council. That's not necessary for annual council, but certainly going forward, we will facilitate that as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Julie, while you're there, have we had any feedback from the Boundary Commission?
Other than just that it's been delayed, is my understanding. Marcus Connor is leading on that, but I can get you a full update, yeah.
No, it's all right. Thank you.
Sarah, perhaps I can just help you on that as well. I just picked up a few emails in Jane Allen's absence, and Julie's quite right that they're going to come back to us with a revised timetable. As I understand it. So, and I think all councils that are involved in this are just waiting to hear, basically. So we will let you know.
Good, thank you. So,
David, I've got two, if I may.
Nick, is that you? Hello, Nick. Yeah, go ahead.
And just on the boundary, I had an email exchange with Marcus at the start of the month. Apparently, the Boundary Commission is getting back to him at the end of the month. I don't know if that helps anybody. Just on, and I'm conscious the Chair of Overview and Scrutiny is on the call, so Bob, don't jump in. But in the spirit of scrutiny and things, I'm just conscious that with the chairs of Health Scrutiny and ONS both being on this meeting now, and obviously we need to look at scrutiny, do we not need to look at potentially, especially in decision making, with maybe Councillor Caserta and Councillor Smith not being on this, so that they can actually then effectively scrutinise? I'm just thinking constitutionally, they're not really supposed to be part of, if that makes sense. And then the other item I just wanted to pick up, we've touched on it on technology. From conversations that I've had with my group this week, it's quite clear that the councillors have an array of iPads and laptops, and they're not all necessarily the same. So is there going to be some kind of audit in the sense that, because I mean, from conversations with Bob this morning, we've both got an iPad, but they're about 3 years apart. So I think we need to bring elected members' kits up to date, if that makes sense, because there's quite a lot of equipment what councillors will have which will not be compatible with Microsoft Teams and other providers that we might use. But yeah, two things there, but I'm just conscious, especially on the scrutiny aspect, we definitely do need health and ONS back up and running, but I don't know if we should have the chairs part of this forum or whether they're just there for information. I don't know.
My understanding of this, and I'll let officers come in a minute, is that the Chair of Overview and Scrutiny is required to be consulted, which is why he's part of this arrangement. Councillor Smith is now not part of this arrangement, and she isn't with us today, because Health Scrutiny has its own sort of scrutiny mechanisms, and we felt that we were getting, I hope this is taken in the right way, but we were getting not bogged down, but we were getting distracted with purely health issues, whereas this group is for council business. It's for the whole structure of everything, including health. And I understand we're in the middle of a health crisis, a health emergency, and it's only natural, therefore, that health are, relevant questions and pertinent and regular. But we've discharged Councillor Smith. She's getting briefed separately, but my understanding is that Councillor Caserta, as Chair of ONS, does need to be consulted. Now, what better way than do it than when we're all here in one place at the same time, rather than do it separately on another occasion? I think
okay.
That's rational.
Yeah, just with that in mind, then, can I have assurances that paragraph 12.06, his ability to call things in within 5 days, with him being part of this, that's not going to impact on his role as chair?
No, and I think I've said it now at nearly every meeting we've had. I think Councillor Caserta has raised it, Bob has raised it, and I've said it doesn't fetter his decision-making process at all.
Yeah.
Now, the urgent decisions are urgent decisions, and they're not for Councillor Caserta's kind of call-in process. They are things that we have agreed as a council that we must get on and deal with because of the urgent nature of it. But certainly other matters, and we haven't had one yet that I'm aware of, that Councillor Caserta would wish to do so. But I wouldn't wish to tie his hands in any way, shape or form. Neither would any other elected member of the Labour group. I think he has an important role to play, and we respect that. Yeah.
Thank
you. Chair, would it help as well just to confirm what you're saying from a constitutional point of view? You're quite right that Councillor Caserta's role, and indeed Councillor Smith's role for health scrutiny, is to be consulted from the point of view that these are indeed urgent decisions. We're using constitutional urgent decision powers, and their role is effectively to confirm that yes, these matters can't be deferred, but it does also mean that they then can't be called in, so that there wouldn't therefore be any conflict in them being party to this. Effectively, this is trying to bring all parties together to be able to effectively undertake the relevant consultation with opposition, with chair of scrutiny from, can these be deferred point of view, and to make the decisions effectively in one fell swoop to save the potential time. And I think, in fairness to all of you, the chair also obviously enabling you to access the updates and also obviously ask questions and comment. But that is the role of this panel. And I take on board what you're saying about wanting to get formal scrutiny meetings up and running as soon as possible, because those will be meetings that obviously can consider decisions that are made in the normal course of business and not done under urgency provisions, and therefore, where appropriate, maybe subject to call in. I hope that helps.
Okay. Just finally, and sorry to harp on about this, so when do we envisage, as you know, we're going to be in this situation for quite some time, it seems, when are we going to go back to normal arrangements or out of this emergency setup? Is there any kind of time frame, or May, or we're not can't be in an emergency forever.
My crystal ball is a bit foggy at the moment, Nick, I'm afraid.
Is it?
Do you know what I mean? I mean, it's really difficult to put a timescale on these things. My instinct, my natural democratic political instinct is the sooner the better.
Yeah.
This is not ideal. This is far from ideal, these arrangements. And to meet in person, where you can look people in the eye, you can use non-verbal communication, and you can have political debate and exchange. That's far healthier than sat in the privacy of your own front room with a big mug of tea or whatever, having a very polite conversation. This is not ideal. So I think what the answer is, as soon as we can, we will get rid of this nonsense, if that's not too a blunt phrase.
That technical term was your words, but yeah, that's very reassuring.
And I hope Joe, I've just realised Benny Times are on. If he thinks this is nonsense, it's not nonsense, Joe. It's a perfectly acceptable way of communicating during an emergency. All right, so can we move on then? Is Mike, have you managed to join us, Mike Woodhead?
I have, yes. Hello, can you hear me?
Hello, Mike. Good afternoon. So, can you give us an update on the financial situation, please?
Yeah, I'm assuming you want me to keep it relatively brief at this point.
Well, I suppose if you give us the salient points, Mike, and then be prepared to take questions, if that's
sure.
okay. Yeah.
So, there's been a whole array of funding announced to do with COVID. So, just as an overview of the funding streams, the main ones coming through have been the guarantee of 100% reimbursement for the retail, hospitality, leisure grant funding, the 10,000s and the 25,000s, which for Bury is likely to be around 43 million pounds. Business rates relief.
Sorry to interrupt. We're not moving into the exempt item here, are we? We're still on the open part of the agenda, aren't we?
Did you get that, Mike?
Yes. So you don't want me to quote figures?
I just want to be clear that obviously at the moment the representative from the press is still here, but if we're moving into the exempt item, he is already aware that we'll be asking him to leave. But I'm also conscious that if he had any questions to ask, we haven't given him an opportunity. So I just need to be clear, if this is the exempt item, we may want to do that before we ask him to leave.
So I think the figures I quoted there are publicly available, but yeah, it's on the MHCLG website. Oh,
right. In that case, carry on, Mike. Thanks, Janet. Yep. I mean, yeah, we need to be clear. These are the complications of having these sort of virtual. Yeah, thanks. Go on, Mike.
The figure I quoted there was an estimate that's available on the MHCLG website.
Yeah.
So other sources of funding, we've been guaranteed will be reimbursed whatever the cost is to us of business rates relief, the wider exemptions, which there isn't a publicly available figure for. And we have got publicly available £1.9 million out of the £500 million national allocation, which you've seen a paper on. That was the urgent decision. Then there's a whole lot of funding being retained centrally by government, which is being used to procure independent sector beds, PPE equipment, and so on. But the other one that's got the big headline is the £5 billion, which has been so far, out of that 5 billion, 1.3 billion has been channeled through is being channeled through local NHS sources, and 1.6 billion through local authority sources. So of the 1.6, Berry's allocation, again, publicly available information, is just under 5.4 million. The NHS side, the 1.3 billion, it's that's an initial allocation, but it's being divvied out on a claims basis. So Bury CCG hasn't got a specific allocation there. Bury CCG is claiming as and when it spends. And we've had very clear statements from NHS England and from the Secretary of State and from the Chancellor of Exchequer. The NHS will get what it needs. So the 5 billion is an initial amount, and it will be increased if it needs to be increased. So what I'll focus on now is what the £5.4 million share of the 1.6 billion that Bury Council have got. I think we need to point out that, whilst that funding was aimed, or it was assumed that that funding would be predominantly used to cover costs of increase of demand on particularly adult social care, but children's services as well, councils are expecting significant impacts in terms of council tax collection, business rates, reductions in other income and fees and charges and commercials. So what I would say is that £5.4 million is not going to cover by a long chalk the pressures of the council, and I think you would have the same conversation in all councils up and down the country. So I think there is going to be a need to lobby for additional funding for local authorities on this, and obviously we're looking at ways to mitigate those pressures, and we will be bearing in mind we will need to think that to the extent that additional funding doesn't come, there is potentially then an impact on council reserves, and we come back to the conversation about resilience and being able to progress the strategy and the budget that we set just a couple of months ago. The position will continue to emerge and change as we go on over the weeks. No one really knows how long this crisis is going to be or how deep it's hitting yet. There will undoubtedly be, as well as pressures in responding to the immediate crisis, there will be, we expect, ongoing pressures because when we come out of this crisis, we're probably going to be faced with a very different landscape in terms of what healthcare looks like and what people's needs are. So I'll pause there. I can say a little bit about the CCG side of the fence as well, if people want me to, but it might be helpful if I just pause there in case of questions on what I've said so far.
Thanks, Mike. Thank you, Mike.
Got a quick one, if I may.
Who is
Sorry.
that? I can hear Bob. Can I hear Bob?
Leader, I'd like to ask Mike a question, but I'm a bit wary to ask it.
There is a restricted part.
Yeah.
So don't ask at the end.
Don't ask.
Okay,
Yeah.
fine.
Thank you.
Forget it.
Thank you.
Thank you. But
Anybody
Chair,
else?
may I? Yeah, Chair, I've got a
Nick?
quick one, if I may.
Yeah, go on, Nick.
Mike, when you touched on obviously lobbying with government, is the council working with both MPs to put the pressure on central government to try and get more funding into the whole local government system, really? Is there like regular briefings and that type of thing? We need a joined up approach so that them two going back to Westminster, which I think is next week or the week after, they can start putting the pressure on.
So we will share this information. The assessment of financial impact was our first assessment of financial impact was literally completed and submitted to MH CLG yesterday. So we're only
second question because the
Okay.
deadline was yesterday, wasn't it? So
Yeah,
thank you.
yeah,
You've answered
yeah.
the second.
So we're now in a position to try and have that conversation, and also, you know, at a national level, organisations such as the LGA and CIPFA are having the same conversations with government departments on behalf of all local authorities at the same time. So that lobbying will go on through a number of different routes. But yeah, I'm sure Jeff will be expecting that information to be made available for the lobbying through the MPs as well.
Okay, thank you. And like I say, you've answered my second question. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Nick. Any other points then for Mike, please? Eamon?
Just one comment for me. Yeah, thanks, Leader. I think Mike has sort of helpfully highlighted the two different challenges we have, which is meeting the immediate costs of a lot of this responsive work, and that's as much about cash flow as it is about you know, the amount we have, and obviously we're still in the process of delivering a lot of that initial sums of money, whether that's in council tax support or deprivation support through local welfare assistance schemes or business support. But then also the fact that there are going to be legacy costs to this, and some of those costs will run for months, others will have impacts for years. And I think the point about lobbying is, you know, it's important, and obviously we should be doing everything possible to raise the issue of local government finance. We've been doing it for 10 years, so we know a little bit about doing it. So I think it's about saying there is an immediate need, and there is also a need to fix the system long term. So one of the fixes to this can simply not be higher taxes on people to pay for services. It can't be making more cuts elsewhere to fund some of this stuff. It will need to be new resource, new money, and a new settlement. So it goes beyond simply a begging bowl saying, can we have some money? It requires government to treat local government properly, seriously, as an actual part of the system, and not something to be battered in another round of cuts. So I'm not saying that's party political. I think we are in a new landscape. I think it goes beyond simply a figure. This is how much money we need. It needs an entirely new approach to local government. That is a bigger task. That will take perhaps a longer time to achieve. But those are the sorts of arguments we will need to be making to government, not simply putting a figure on what it might cost us and expecting a bank transfer. And I just wanted to make that comment. Thanks, Leader.
Thank you, Eamon. I'm sure Mike Woodhead and our Chief Exec have registered what your comments. Any other points for Mike then, please, colleagues? No? So moving on then, on my scribbled agenda, the operational decision log, and then the notes from the last meeting. Has anybody got any comments, observations on those two items? If that's a no, I'll at this point, I'm going to dive in with both feet and ask Joe Tinman, who I believe is the only press officer on the call, if he has any comments, Joe, of myself or perhaps any of the elected members on what you've heard this afternoon.
Yeah, I've got a few quick questions. I'll try and keep them short. Just on what the Chief Exec was saying at the beginning about the peak being longer and flatter. Do you know how long the flatter peak is expected to last? And is that based on GM predictions? What's happening in Greater Manchester? Are we talking about a national picture here? And just going back to something that was said about a month ago when I spoke to you, Jeff, you said that the council was working towards business as usual sort of arrangements in September. That's what the financial planning was working towards. Obviously, it's been a month since then. Is that still the case? Is there a new sort of target when it comes to financial planning? On PPE stock, just hearing what the Mayor of Greater Manchester was saying yesterday, the language he's using seems to be a bit more concerned overall as a GM picture than what we're saying in Bury in terms of the stocks that Bury has. I was just wondering if Bury has been asked to help out other boroughs, or if it's likely that it will do if it has these stocks. And just a final, just my understanding of the status of these meetings, papers from previous meetings like this of the urgent decisions group aren't available currently online. I was just wondering if those were in theory all publicly available decisions and if they can be made available. And now that these meetings, I assume, will continue to be taking place on some kind of video conference, will recordings be available online as well for members of the public to see? Thank you.
If I can answer your last point, Joe, we're working towards exactly that. We were hoping to live stream today so that it would be available to the wider community of people of Bury. That's always going to be our ambition. The technology is king, as I think you've heard us say a few times, and we are controlled by what's available to us. So yeah, initially when we set this group up, it was seen as a private council consultation process with leaders of opposition parties. As we get to grapple with the issues, the political issues, the decision-making process, I don't think we need to be feeling so restrained, and we can relax it as we should do. We should be more open. So moving forward, I would anticipate, and I think you heard our council, the Deputy Monitoring Officer, Janet, speaking earlier, about our ambition to have other meetings live streamed, you know, whether it's overview and scrutiny or whatever. So this is part of a naturally evolving process, I think, that will get to where you've just suggested, but it's not happened yet. It's not for the lack of any willpower. It's the wizardry of what we're working with.
Councillor Jones, can I just come in, Julie Gallagher?
Go on, Julie.
Just following on from your comment around decisions taken via this meeting, there is a legal requirement. They are actually published online, and there is a page on our website that lists all the special urgency decisions taken. So I'll send you an email and a link to that page, and it also has the notes from all the meeting as well, so you'll be able to see everything on there. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Julie.
Thanks, Julie. That's helpful. Jeff, did you want to respond to Joe's initial queries, please?
Yeah, I think there are three. First of all, no, I don't know, and I don't believe anybody else knows how much longer the flatter, longer peak will be. There are epidemiologists working on this nationally at Greater Manchester level and here in Bury. But the truth is, nobody knows with any precision how long will be. That then links to your second question about when we are expecting to be able to replan our finances. I would suggest that the council will only be in a position to do that properly once there's been a comprehensive spending review for the country as a whole. And again, we don't know how long the peak will last. We don't know when restrictions will be lifted, and therefore we don't know when there will be a reassessment of the country's finances for the public sector, and therefore an opportunity for us to reassess our own. September was our best guess at that point. My best guess at the moment would be it'll be a bit longer than that, but I couldn't tell exactly when. On PPE, I think I said in my remarks earlier that I was not at all complacent about the availability of PPE for social care services, nor indeed out of hospital services as a whole for Bury. And yes, I'm sure the Mayor of Greater Manchester would have put perhaps more forcibly than I have done the issue, but and no doubt is a major issue for both Bury and Greater Manchester, and I would imagine many other parts of the country.
Thank you, Jeff. Is that okay, Joe?
Can I just ask specifically on that point of helping out other boroughs? Is there anything you can say about that?
Oh, yeah, apologies. No, we are no better off than other boroughs for PPE at all. What I will say is that all Greater Manchester councils and the health service across Greater Manchester are working absolutely together on this. We have regular conversations about it at the Greater Manchester Emergency Committee and at an official level across chief executives of the councils and with the health service leadership. So rest assured, although we are no better off, we are all helping each other with PPE, given its vital importance to the safety of staff and to patients.
Thanks, Jeff. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Joe. Thank you for your time, and perhaps we'll speak to you next week at the same time.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Just bear with me a minute.